Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Flynn, and today I am here to talk a little bit about the history of Native American education. In pre Columbian times, Native Americans received their education orally and verbally, passed down from generation to generation, and it typically consisted of survival skills and means of navigating tribal Native American society. Um, Later on, after Columbian contact had occurred, Native or European settlers began to appear in North America, and they began to receive an education from the natives, particularly in regards to those skills in how to navigate and survive North America. So, when we look at the origins of the relationship between natives and colonists, we see that the education is actually primarily coming on behalf of the natives who are educating the colonists. Now, as we will see over time and the colonists gain more influence, this will not always be the case. As eventually the colonizers would begin to secure that influence and they would begin to exert it to take up what they called the white man's burden, which is, of course, an old ideal where people from Europe feel that it is their duty and their burden to educate inferior and savage peoples from elsewhere in the world. The people who initially took up this challenge were primarily missionaries and religious groups, especially in Spanish colonies further down, but even up in North America, there were missionaries looking to spread their religion of Christianity to the native groups and felt that it was their responsibility to educate these people in their enlightened ways. Eventually, as the country reached its own independence and began to explore the concept of manifest destiny, we begin to enter what is called the treaty era of Native American education. This is an era that saw essentially more of the same, except less religious education and more focused on secularism, still emphasizing the white man's burden and a responsibility to attempt to help these quote unquote savage peoples navigate a quickly modernizing society. One of the most significant of these treaties is known as the Indian Civilization Act of 1819. This began to open up some opportunities for essentially proto charitable organizations to begin to expand their efforts to begin essentially what they called civilizing these individuals, these people of Native American origin. And in their efforts to civilize these people, they began to open what were called Indian schools. These are probably the most notorious of the educational institutions utilized for Native American education, and most likely for good reason. Essentially, the typical initial goal, like I said, was assimilation, really. They wanted to try and turn these people into people who would live in a traditionally American way, respect American customs, pay American taxes, fight in American wars, the whole nine yards. Unfortunately, what they found, or unfortunately for them, what they found was a great deal of resistance among these groups to assimilate. They wanted to perpetuate their own culture, their own identities. They wanted to celebrate it and they wanted to maintain it. So, what you see is a history of conflict that begins to develop. And you'll see a lot of this conflict actually comes from a pretty justified position, considering what was going on at some of these Indian boarding schools. Essentially, people were being taken, forcefully converted to Christianity. They were denied their language, their culture, their heritage, oftentimes given white, quote unquote, names to be used exclusively in their new lives. And it becomes pretty apparent that the government's goal during the treaty era was plain and simple assimilation. But they were doing it in a means where they were trying to at least keep up a facade of a legal defensibility of an attempt to help these people, but still respect their sovereignty to at least some degree officially, even though unofficially, what we have here is an ethnic. A cleansing on our hands, essentially, a cultural genocide at the very least. As we move to the later half of the 19th century into the late 1800s, the agenda becomes a bit more transparent by the United States government. The goal really begins to shift here from assimilation to tribal dissolution and to breaking up tribes in order to really destroy the idea of tribal identity. This is called the allotment period, and this is where they would begin to assign reservations in which many Indian groups would be forcefully and relocated to. They began to designate certain parcels of land while simultaneously denying tribes certain sovereign rights and rights to practice their own cultural traditions, their own cultural customs, and even speaking their own language. These were things that were completely denied to these people as the U.S. government moved to the allotment strategy. So, what the Allotment Act or what the Dawes Act specifically states um, is one, the President of the United States shall allot tribal lands in designated quantities 160 acres to each family head, 80 acres to each single person over 18, and each orphan under 18, and 40 acres to each single person under 18. Two, each Indian will make his own selection, but if he failed or refused, a government agent would make the selection for him. Three, titles were continued in trust for 25 years or longer at the president's discretion. Four, citizenship was conferred upon all allottees and upon other Indians who abandoned their tribes and adopted the habits of civilized life. And five, surplus tribal lands remained after allotment might be sold to the United States. So here, in addition to some of the forceful relocations, we see the United States government effectively bribing people. Please leave your tribes and leave your ways behind. And we see a reflection of this within the education system of the Native Americans. This is the part where schools really start to get aggressive with white man's names, with taking away the language. But this all raises the question, are these people even citizens, really? Which they wouldn't be for another 40 years or so. It wasn't until 1924 where we begin to see the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 in response to Indians who served in World War One. But you see, all this effort is going in all this time, and you see there isn't even really an end goal in sight for these people, as Indians are considered citizens of their tribe this entire time up until 1924, not citizens of the United States. So you can see any efforts to quote unquote assimilate or turn these people into quote unquote Americans would be disingenuous at best. Now, as we move into the FDR administration, we start to get a little bit of positive news for Native Americans in the form of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 that is going to put an end to allotment and start to provide some real financial incentive and opportunity for Native Americans and for respecting their sovereignty, but simultaneously we are going to see money offered to Native Americans in the form of scholarships to study at schools outside of reservations. So always as an educational movement, sort of, we're looking at assimilation really over education being prioritized here. And in the post-war world, about 20 years later, we really start to see some of the most aggressive anti-native policy begin to emerge in what is called termination policy. The idea is that the tribes would be terminated. At the very least, their identities would be terminated. Essentially, termination means that tribes would be forcefully disbanded. They would no longer be recognized by their local or federal governments as tribes or as sovereign bodies, and the people would be granted citizenship immediately into the U.S. government. Now, obviously, this was met with a great deal of resistance from all sides, and really, especially as we moved from the 50s into the 60s, we see it get co opted essentially by the civil rights movement. It joins the civil rights movement, and now Native American education and Native American civil rights are at the forefront along with everybody else, and we can start to finally start to see and recognize some positive change. And once we start seeing these positive changes from the civil rights movement, it really catches like wildfire. We see the Nixon administration turn to an emphasis on self determination, which is to this day the general de jure policy in regards to Native American education. The federal government has taken their hands off. Um, Now, these schools obviously still deal with any of the modern issues that modern schools have, lack of funding, dealing with those federal standards and biases, but they are now allowed to teach their languages, celebrate their cultures, their holidays, their traditions, like I said, speak to each other in their traditional languages and teach each other their tribal traditions. It's safe to say things have come a long, long way from the days of forced white man names and abducting children to be shanghaied into boarding schools. So, in conclusion, I want to thank you for taking this little journey with me here today. As we can see, the origins dating back from pre Columbian periods all the way up to modern day. It has been an interesting struggle and really an inspiring struggle, in my opinion, looking at what Native Americans have been able to do to persevere and survive in the face really of insurmountable odds, seemingly sometimes. It's one of the more remarkable tales of the human spirit, and one of the best cautionary tales of the dangers of trusting the government.